A century after the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans in the South were still denied access to good housing, high-quality education, employment, and basic amenities. Many had begun to fight the complex web of racism that characterized American society, especially in southern states. The 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, encouraged many to believe that racism could be eradicated, or at least tamed. The success of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and 56 further encouraged civil rights workers. Thus, the African American community entered the 1960s with the belief that nonviolent protests and legal action could make a difference. Beginning in 1960, students held sit-ins at segregated lunch counters throughout the South in order to desegregate them. This was one of the first signs of the increased youth participation that would characterize the civil rights movement in the 60s. Young black activists formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, SNCC, aimed to desegregate public facilities and register black voters. Students also played a critical role in the freedom rides organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, and later by SNCC. In addition to integrating lunch counters and bus stations, the civil rights movement continued the campaign to integrate the American educational system. National attention focused on the University of Mississippi in 1962, when federal troops were called in to enable James Meredith to register. Civil rights was again at the center of national discourse in the spring of 1963, with the television coverage of police brutality against nonviolent demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama. The climax of the nonviolent civil rights movement was the 1963 March on Washington. Assembled at the Lincoln Memorial were 250,000 people lobbying for civil rights legislation and hearing a stirring oration delivered by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. After the march, it became clear that many activists were disappointed and frustrated with the results of nonviolent protests. Individuals like Malcolm X persuaded many with their support of black separatism, while others advocated an armed struggle against oppression. In 1963 and 64, a coalition of civil rights organizations in Mississippi launched Freedom Summer, a project to register black voters and promote voting rights. 15 volunteers were killed, including Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. A month after a 1965 voter registration march to Selma, Alabama, Malcolm X, who had begun to rethink his anti-white stance, was assassinated in New York. During a 600-person civil rights march from Montgomery to Selma, the state trooper attack known as Bloody Sunday occurred, injuring more than 50 individuals. 2 people, both white, died as a result of attacks during the course of the march. Rioting broke out in the Watts section of Los Angeles. At James Meredith's March Against Fear in the summer of 1966, the critical change of emphasis in the civil rights movement became clear. When Stokely Carmichael, the new national chairman of SNCC, roused the crowd with shouts of "Black Power," he ushered in the Black Power era. The newly militant SNCC joined forces with the Student Organization for Black Unity and the Black Panther Party, which had been forming in Oakland, California. While the slogan "Black Power" helped create a positive sense of racial pride in many blacks, it also fostered violence and anti-white hatred in others. Riots occurred in Chicago, Cleveland, and San Francisco in 1966, then in Newark and Detroit the following year. In 1968, the SNCC coalition broke up. Clashes between black militants and police forces led to many deaths and arrests. In the same year, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. was assassinated, causing a series of riots across the nation. Despite the blows to the African American community, including the assassinations of John and Robert Kennedy, the later 60s produced some civil rights gains. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 protected housing rights. A number of black Americans obtained prominent and obscure positions in government and other areas of influence and importance. In colleges and universities, black students formed all-black activist groups, some of which began demonstrating in favor of establishing Afro-American studies departments. Several colleges assented, and when Harvard University set up its department in 1969, it lent credibility to the idea of African American studies. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that schools had to be desegregated immediately. By 1969, individuals attacking blacks were more aggressively prosecuted than ever before, helping to deter racist violence against blacks. Nevertheless, there were still many problems to address. African Americans had obtained full legal rights according to federal law, but in many sectors and regions, those laws were not fully enforced. In addition, the black community lacked unity of purpose and mission, as many members of the black bourgeoisie began to seek their own interests, leaving behind those rural and inner-city blacks in need of support. The African American community exited the 60s with more legal rights and opportunities than before, but with less optimism and focus than in the beginning of the decade.